we have General Mick Ryan.
Hello, good to be back with you again.
Good day, sir.
Welcome, sir, to the panel. I hope you're having a good one.
Yes, no, it's a very pleasant winter here at the moment. Still in shorts and flip-flops as winter is here, so life's good.
Rubbing it in from the other side of the planet. Yeah, well, you can't do that in Canada in our winter. So there's that. Well, listen, so I just want to kick it off. Thanks again for joining us. We have a big crowd. We've actually had a very eventful week. Just to give you a bit of a sit rep, we've had some big journalists come in. We've had a unique personality on the internet, James Vasquez. I'm not sure if you've heard of him.
Yep.
And Rip Rawlings, Colonel Rawlings was on. It was a great time, actually. A very, very deep, emotive conversation. It lasted about 4 hours. And then Colonel Rawlings came in as well. They're working together. We had a lot to talk about. It was primarily on the personal experiences. And then obviously that big update question I like to ask, like, where do you see us now? What's the current situation? If you want to, I know there's a lot of questions about where things are going politically, so there's a geopolitical component, but then one of our favorite topics as of late has been, do you know what time it is? And the only answer is HIMARS o'clock. So was curious on your take. They're in theater, they're moving and grooving. Let's start off with that.
Yeah, I think the introduction of HIMARS has certainly shifted the balance a little bit away from the Russians. Certainly the Russians over the last month have used their preponderance of artillery to, move, albeit slowly, but continue to make progress in the Donbass. I think the Ukrainians, having HIMARS now, are allowed to kind of step back from this attritional fight that the Russians have drawn them into in the east and fight the kind of fight that the Ukrainians would prefer, which is attacking the Russian system indirectly to corrode their logistics, their command and control, and their logistic systems, which then makes, the close combat a far more even proposition for the Ukrainians. It's not a silver bullet. It will not win the war for the Ukrainians, but it will certainly give them a step up. It will give them a profound operational advantage, assuming the Russians aren't able to adapt too quickly to the application of HIMARS.
Excellent. So just to switch gears a bit and go back to the comments that I'm not sure I can attribute any of them to you, but some of our other distinguished guests spoke about an eventual culmination. That's the word we'll use. A pause. The Russians will there will be a moment where, not necessarily because of ammunition stores being depleted or destroyed, but they'll have to take that pause. And I think it's fair to say about a week ago, they declared their own tactical operational pause. I'm sure it had nothing to do with a loss of a certain amount of ammunition, but let's just say it did. So would you consider that a new phase of this war? Would you consider that Russians reorienting, consolidating, reinforcing, and this being and the answer to the second part of my question, which is, and this being the Ukrainians' chance to position themselves a little differently?
Yeah, I think I'm not sure they actually are taking an operational pause. It's not clear to me that the evidence supports a Russian operational pause at the moment. I think clearly in the first phase of this war, the advance on Kiev, the culmination of the Russian advance was pretty clear to me and a lot of others at a certain point. It's not clear whether the Russians are at that point at the moment. Clearly they're under pressure, but they're still fighting on the Eastern Front. They are still conducting a range of strikes across Ukraine, both on logistics hub, but also, what we could probably best describe as terror strikes against the populace of Ukraine. And you can't really describe them as anything more than that. So I'm not sure we actually are seeing an operational pause, even though the Russians said that They say lots of things, as we've seen in this war, and most of them we can't trust. So I think we shouldn't be lulled into a sense that, the Russians are being fought to a standstill or anything like that. I think what we're seeing is a lower tempo period, which we see in all wars. But you wouldn't have called, December 1914, when the Germans and French had fought themselves to exhaustion in the first phase of World War, an operational pause. They just eased back and then got into it again. And I think that's probably more of what we're seeing in the East rather than an operational pause.
General Ryan, if you can
Hello?
hear us now, we lost your audio, so we dropped you down from speaker.
he's coming
Hello?
Back to you back
Hey
up.
there. We got you, sir. Go ahead.
Sorry, you cut off. I have no idea how much of what I said you guys got. It just cut out at the end of when I was speaking.
Yeah, no worries. We got most of it there. Just to circle back to the questions, just to go on a flow here. So, regardless if it's an operational pause, which they're not stopping. Obviously, they're doing still mass fires and obviously these terror rocket attacks. But regardless of we call it culmination, is this an opportune time? It's kind of a softball, but I mean, what can the Ukrainians do now with their force generation that they couldn't do before? What could they do? What is this, whatever it is, culmination? What advantages does that give Ukrainian planners and ops people, for the next tactical bound or the next strategic, thrust?
I think the key thing really is taking a breath and looking at where do they allocate their main effort for the next phase. Is their main effort defending in the east, or is their main effort taking back the south? My sense, and it has been for some time, and I've written about this, is the south is the decisive theatre in Ukraine. The Ukrainians need it back to generate revenue. The economic problems they face are at least as profound as the military challenges they face, and they have to get their export markets back. So, I think this current lower tempo period allows the Ukrainians to ponder how they might allocate their assets around taking back the south, which, by the way, they have been directed to do by their government. And then think about how do they generate the forces for it. It's not clear to me that they're able to actually generate sufficient forces to conduct the offensive themselves without more assistance from NATO. That before this war, the Ukrainian military, the ground forces in particular, was around 250,000, give or take. About 40% of that was conscripts. So they had a model where they could train around 150,000 people a year. Now, they've gone from 250 to 700,000, according to the Ukrainian government. To have done that, they will have to have taken shortcuts with training. And that will hurt when it comes to offensive operations, because whilst it might be simple to train an infantryman, it's much, much harder to train the company, battalion, brigade, divisional commanders who must plan and lead the complex integration of combined arms effects. That's the kind of challenge I'm looking at the moment, going, have they got this problem sorted, and where can NATO help?
Makes sense. So if we were to paint a picture to the audience following along, we have initial invasion that obviously peters out, and then they reorient and they get to the Donbass. They push as hard as they can, and they obviously have some other plans in mind. But here, the Ukrainians have an opportunity to bring to bear their other forces, and presumably to create an effect in the Kherson Oblast area. Would that be where you think they were the easiest, or their initial target of opportunity would be?
Well, I think they need to. There's Kherson, but also Zaporizhzhia, which is important for a couple of reasons. Firstly, because if you're able to penetrate deep enough, you really start messing with the Russian logistic connectivity between the east and the south. But secondly, you have some pretty major power generation capability in that region, which we shouldn't forget is also important. If the Ukrainians are going to get their economy back working, especially with heavy industry that's in the south and these kind of things. So they're both important. But it really remains to be seen, can they generate the integrated offensive capability for a broader offensive rather than these localized counterattacks that we're currently seeing in the Kherson area.
100%. You want to go to CJ?
Hey, sir. Great to have you back here. While we're talking big picture and strategy, I kind of wanted to pick your brain on this sort of topic, considering you're such a voice of not optimism per se, but just a fresh take in the media space where everything seems to always be doom and gloom. And so I guess let's say from your point of view, sir, you're on the Russian general staff. And this might not be a pause, but it's certainly what we'd call a decision point. How are you going to proceed if you want to continue? I think we all know that Russia was planning on going on the defensive at some point, but I think personally this was a bit sooner than they had wanted to. Without the ability to fully mobilize or get new troops, where do you spend your efforts? Do you try and innovate to get around HIMARS and these newer and better weapons? Do you try and rehash combined arms? I guess what direction would you go if you were the Russians?
I think that's an important question, right? We need to anticipate what the enemy will do. I think defending the south will be a very important task for the Russians. As much as they want to kill the Ukrainian army, even more, they will want to kill Ukraine's capacity to generate revenue, which is a really important part of being a sovereign nation. And let's remember, for Russia, this is all about denying Ukraine the capacity to be a sovereign, democratic nation that is able to determine its own destiny. And one of the best ways you can do that is kill their ability to earn money. So I think from a strategic perspective, holding on to the south will be really important for that. But the other part of that too is if the Russians can defeat Ukrainian offensives in the south, they know that certain countries in Europe are more likely to want to force an accommodation on the Ukrainians. I think that's just realistic. There are some countries in Europe that are not bought into supporting Ukraine regardless of what they said at the NATO or the G7 summits. So for two perspectives, I think the Russian main effort, if that was my choice, that's probably where I would be looking. But also we need to accept that Putin has made commitments around the Donbass region. So at some point, even if it's not in this phase, but at some point he is also going to have to follow through and, look at attempting to take all of the Donetsk region.
That seems to make sense. Yehuda, sorry, I just have one last follow-up, and I'll cede the floor. No, I guess, sir, from your opinion, you're talking about, from what I understand, a political end that Russia is trying to force, as opposed to, sort of a military solution on the ground. As time goes on, do you think this becomes more or less likely, especially as winter approaches? There's been some that have said Russia will be in a stronger bargaining position when all of Europe is freezing. I just want to know your take on how you think that'll trend moving forward.
I don't disagree with that proposition. I think if you're Putin, you're looking at certain countries in Europe who have not really thought through their future energy in a very strategic way by decommissioning nuclear, which is the cheapest and safest way of generating low emission energy, and then have really yoked themselves to the Russian energy sector. So Putin will look at that. He will go, I reckon if I can hold out for 6 months, there's going to be more pressure by the population of certain European countries on their governments, and their governments will want to put pressure on the government of Ukraine to, and accept an accommodation where they give up territory for peace. Now, we all know that's not going to be a sustainable peace in the long term. Russia will never be satisfied until it destroys Ukraine. But I think that is part of Putin's calculus. I also think that's why you're seeing all these missile strikes. They are about terrorizing Ukrainians, but also terrorizing everyone else who might be thinking about investing in Ukraine.
Any follow-up there, CJ?
No, that's great. And again, thanks for stopping by here. We really appreciate it.
No worries. It's great to be here again.
So one last question for me for a second. I have to have domestic niner concern, but sir, and we'll go to but angry 2-year-old.
I know what that's like.
Yeah, there you go. And I can't say no, apparently. Just before I pass it off to Walter, there is a question. There's a concern. we said longer range artillery and 777s. We said this and that, and we gave. Now we're at HIMARS. Is the next step more HIMARS when it comes to equipment, or is the next step? What do you think the next ask is? Tanks, or is it a lot more HIMARS? It's a question people ask because we've asked for it, and even if there's 12, or some people might have heard that there might be 30 platforms by the end of the month, which would be great. But is that still enough?
In short, no. But it's, like I said, it's not the silver bullet that some people hope it will be. I mean, you and I both know there will be politicians out there who think, oh, we've given them 30 HIMARS. Haven't they won already? Which is a ludicrous proposition, but that's how some people think. HIMARS is important. Ammunition for HIMARS and field artillery is important because they're still going to need that for the close fight. I think the next ask really will be APCs/IFVs, because if you're on the offensive, they're going to need to mechanise more of their force. And then to do that, they're going to need training. So I think there's a training, there's a mechanisation arm to this, and then there's the deep fight piece of this, which is HIMARS, intelligence, and a range of other capabilities they might need for deep fight, including potentially ATACMS.
Potentially.
Well, I think ATACMS is the way they have to go. I mean, the beauty of ATACMS is that it allows them to hold the Russian naval port at risk. So if, there's no progress in the negotiations in Turkey to allow Ukrainian wheat and other produce to come out through the Black Sea, the Ukrainians may not have any options but to say to the Russians, you need to stop the blockade or we're going to sink all your non-nuclear ships at the quayside in Crimea.
Is the tit for tat necessary, or can they just hit the jetties?
Well, Ukrainians didn't start this, right? And it's been the Russians who've been blockading them. I think the Ukrainians would be justified in taking whatever action against military platforms to break that blockade that's necessary. If NATO won't step in, the Ukrainians are going to have to take their own action to generate revenue so their country can survive.
Let's just talk about the APCs for a second, because that's a big question. It's something that's come up quite a bit from your, obviously, operational experience. Are we looking at, the APCs in order to kit out those mechanized infantry units to make these actual combined arms attacks on Russian positions? And if so, what about these quite antiquated BMP, the ones that were given, quite a number of them? Are they sufficient to do the task required? What are your thoughts?
Well, as many of you know, there's an old saying, a second-class ride's better than a first-class walk.
My apologies, that was my finger. Second-class ride, first-class walk, sir. Go ahead. General Ryan, if you could just unmute your mic, sir.
Sorry. Even if we're not talking about the latest generation Bradley fighting vehicles, APCs and some of the older generation Soviet vehicles will still help them generating mobility and be able to move more quickly than what they are at the moment. I think this mechanisation, if they're going to go on to the offensive, is going to be a really important foundation.
So do you think what they've received so far from Eastern Bloc countries, is that even close to enough, or are we talking 1,000 more? Just if you know the answer.
We're talking probably talking a couple thousand more. You're talking about mechanising many brigades. We're not talking about our armies where we have 2 or 3 mech brigades. We're talking about a scale that's 10 times that. And then you've also got to have a training stock, and you need a replacement stock because we're going to lose them as well. So, we're talking in the 1,000 to 2,000 of APCs/IFVs because we're in a high attrition high usage environment, but working at a scale that most of our armies have not seen for 60 or 70 years.
So these 1, 2, 300 BMP 1s or 2s or whatever, that's not going to cut it.
No, I mean, it's useful, and they shouldn't be denigrated in any way because they are of some use. But, we're talking, if we are really going to look at offensive operations of a scale that we just have not seen since the Second World War.
100%. All right, Joseph.
Yeah, thanks so much for coming, General Ryan. So I guess what you just said sort of made me think about the British training program right now that's going on, where they're standing up, I believe, 10,000 soldiers or a certain number. And I guess like what you said that got me thinking was they need training stock, right? And in terms of the UK, I know they're teaching them to fight on those infantry fighting vehicles. So do you think that might be a possible way to expand training for Ukraine in terms of we can send them to the U.S. to use U.S. training stock and train them on U.S. fighting vehicles there, and then they can come back? Or do you think that it's better to keep them in country and train them there? Thanks.
My sense is the best way to do this is get them out of country. It's for a couple of reasons. One, you can do it without interference from the Russians. But two, as we know from training, the best training is that that's conducted away from distractions. And if you get them out of country and get them away from the distractions of, family, of being potentially pulled away at short notice, I think that is a much better solution. But, I think, this is something I've been contemplating writing about. During the Second World War, the British set up the Empire Air Training Scheme, which Canada was a very large part of, as was Australia, and they set up training bases all over the Commonwealth, or the Empire as it was, and they brought in pilots and aircrew from all over the Commonwealth. I think NATO needs a combined arms training system that sets up something the same, where every country in NATO commits to taking 5, 10, 20,000 Ukrainian soldiers, NCOs and officers to either train them as recruits, train their leaderships, do tactics, all these kind of things, using a common curricula, not that country, but a common curricula agreed by the Ukrainians to generate the hundreds of thousands of soldiers that will be required to undertake a mechanised offensive at some point in the medium term.
So this number that's come out, the 700,000 reservists who fought in the Donbass, is this a notional number, or it's close to real? I'd assume they've been training in the background for the last few months, no?
It's hard to know, isn't it, really? The Ukrainians have been pretty good at operational security, as they should be, and as we would expect them to be. I think the million, from what I'm seeing in open source, includes border guards, internal security, and these kind of things. I think the 700,000 figure, which includes territorial forces and mobilised soldiers, is probably closer to it. But if you have a look at what their training capacity was before the war, I think the training that this 700,000 have received is rudimentary. There are multiple open source reports about people being pulled out of training, even after several days to go to fill holes on the front. It's not a criticism of the Ukrainian High Command. It's just a statement of, what's the reality at the time. But I think at some point there needs to be a recognition that the training system needs to be enhanced, supercharged, if they're really going to be an effective combined arms offensive capability to take back these parts of territory which has been seized by the Russians over the last 5 months.
So from some of our sources there, and as you know, we've people on our team train these people and whatnot.
Yeah.
And some of the comments have been that a lot that of the 700, a good 400,000, maybe 500 were actually, had done their 9 months in Donbass in the last 5 years, and obviously their tradecraft is, most countries after 5 years, your training goes to nil, and then you go retrain, right?
Mm.
But these are people with some, obviously not all of them were combat arms soldiers or officers. A lot of them were obviously log people, maintainers, whatnot. But bringing them back into the fight, surely the delta is far smaller than if they were coming in off the street from Civvy Street. No.
Oh, absolutely, it is. But remember, sophisticated combined arms operations is a perishable skill. And if you don't do it, and if you haven't done it for a while, which most of these people will not have, and certainly their commanders won't have done it because they would have been doing defensive operations in trenches out in eastern Ukraine, they're going to have to be trained in it. They're going to have to rehearse. I mean, there's a reason why we rehearse things even when we're really good. Because this is really hard and you need to iron out problems. So, I think the number of 700,000 kind of glosses over the profound challenges of developing a modern, mechanised ground force that's able to integrate all the elements of the combined arms team. I mean, this is so hard to do. I know, I've done it as a brigade commander. It is really, really hard to get right. It doesn't mean we need to be training them for years, but some level of both individual and collective training to prepare them for these offensives is probably going to be needed.
100%. And for those who are unaware, for example, and even in Western nations like Canada and Australia, we have validation exercises, level 5, live fire exercises. We have things that we do in order to maintain our currency. I guess I would assume, I hadn't really thought that through for a second, the Ukrainian that was fighting in Donbass 5 years ago wasn't doing much combined arms training. They were probably just doing defensive, work because that's what they had on their plate.
Yep.
So,
which isn't a criticism. It's just this is what they were doing then. The requirement has changed. They need to adapt their training for that requirement.
Fair enough. So ostensibly, if it was you that was a brigade commander, you'd like to be able to shake out your troops on a bunch of live fire level 5 or like collective training for people. I'm referring to training that involves different trades within the military, within the army, for example. So you're using, engineers working with infantry and armored and artillery. So that's the kind of exercise you want to see the Ukrainians get proficient on before presumably making these advances into Kherson, etc.
Well, even basic things like chutes for company, battalion, brigade commanders. You don't have to have all your troops in the field to do these things, and frankly, they're probably not going to have a lot of time to be doing brigade and division level training manoeuvres. But you can spend time, both in a live as well as a simulated and virtual environment, to prepare tactical leaders for integrated combined arms activities. They will be very valuable and high return on investment activities if we're able to do them.
Excellent. Okay, let's go. We have a few hands up. Dry fly, then Leonard.
Hi, thank you for coming in. I got a quick question.
Sure.
It's a question I ask everybody who is on this site who has a strategic background and has actually done it. And the guys that are listening, like Yehuda, will laugh. But I ask about insurgency behind the line simultaneous to the organized attack. And I say that because my expectation is that Ukraine isn't going to get everything they want. They're not going to come close to getting everything they want to be able to run a NATO-style offensive. And the one wild card they have is that it's in their home turf. Their people are there. They know the land. So I expect, especially...
we might have... All right, so let's try. We'll just boot... is he there? Okay, sir, let's go to... He's asked this question many times. The effects of partisans in the rear... what's the value of it? How do you think it works?
Yeah, I think this is really important. The Ukrainian resistance movement was something the Ukrainians have been preparing for a while, right? They've been thinking about this since 2014. There was a level of stockpiling and advisors put in place before the war, quietly, but they were put there. And you're seeing, particularly around the Kherson and Zaporizhzhia areas, pamphlet campaigns, the targeting of Russian and Ukrainian collaborators, blowing up of train lines, these kind of things. These serve a couple of really important missions for the Ukrainian High Command more broadly. Firstly, it has the Russians looking in front and behind them. And we shouldn't underestimate the psychological impact. When you're a soldier, you're not just fighting the enemy who's, bombing or shelling or shooting at you, but you've got someone potentially behind you. And this is going to be a significant issue for the Russians for morale and how they treat local populations. Secondly, these resistance movements form a really important intelligence function. I mean, how do you think the Ukrainians have been doing some of the targeting on some of these large artillery depots well behind the lines? So, I think the resistance movement, if it's coordinated and led well, and, there's a good feed of information one way and a feed of support the other, I think it will play an important part in the eventual liberation of southern Ukraine.
Perfect, thank you. We're going to go to Konstantin, actually. We're going to redirect Konstantin. He's a Ukrainian artilleryman, veteran living in the United States now, but he spent a good chunk of time in Donbass. Go ahead, Konstantin.
Hello, General. It's a pleasure speaking with you. I've heard, and I totally agree with what you're saying, that Ukraine right now to go on the offensive needs much more kit for the mechanized brigades, because the mechanized brigade is the essential assist that mechanized infantry takes those liberates the villages after the artillery has done the preparation. So my question is this: you said about infantry fighting vehicles, APCs, and I did not hear you say tanks, but I assume tanks. You agree that tanks are just as needed. But which did you ever look at this question a bit deeper, and which infantry fighting vehicles are actually available for Ukraine in the world right now, or you did not look into specifics of this? Because as far as I know, in large quantities, there are only Bradleys and Marders that are available, and the rest is just Russian equipment, which is obviously is not going to be available in large quantities for Ukraine to replenish.
I think they probably need APCs, which you fight from, and IFVs, which you fight in. The reason I like the M113 at the moment is because it is a very simple vehicle to train and maintain. It has a very simple weapon system. I mean, as you know, an IFV normally has 25 or 30 millimeter weapon in a turret, and the training liability for the crew of an IFV, particularly in the turret, is far, far more than it is for a crew commander in something like an APC. So I think we need to be very careful about the numbers of IFVs versus APCs that we send to Ukraine, just because, we should be making life easy, both in a training and a maintenance capacity. But I'd also say you can't mechanise the entire force. Even the US Army in the Second World War, which was the most mechanised force we've seen, only had 10 armoured divisions out of 80 divisions. The rest were straight leg infantry or airborne. So Ukrainians will need to think about how much mechanised/armour do they need, which is really about breakthrough battle, break in, break through, and then how much is a more light infantry force that doesn't have the same level of mechanisation, heavy armour and those kind of things. My sense is probably 1 to 5 or something like that as a back of a cigarette packet. But there's going to have to be a balance there. When you look at IFVs, Marders, no way. I mean, I just don't think that's going to happen. There's been a whole lot of things and a whole lot of political reasons why I can't see that happening. But Bradleys could be possible, but I do think M113 variants, of which there are tens of thousands in the world, including those my country are giving and should be giving more of, I actually think that's probably not a bad solution.
Excellent. All right, let's go over to Leonard.
Thank you, Yehuda. And it's a pleasure to hear your analysis, General Ryan. And it's, the insights that you're offering are just invaluable. But I have a question for you with respect to the really boiling down to a force-on-force assessment. And I'm going to try to draw you out a little bit in terms of a committal in terms of where you project this thing might go. But firstly, I'm going to just tickle a bit as far as your expertise on strategic geopolitical affairs goes. And I'm in Canada. So we've paid considerable attention to the Russians for a number of years. And not to make light of things, but in the area of hockey, we've actually put them under heavy fire a number of times and seen how they react under pressure. And there's a certain famous team in Western Canada that I won't mention had remarkable success against the Forerunner teams, the Wings of the Soviet, the Red Army teams, etc. And we've seen how they behave under fire, under heavy fire, but that's only on the ice. Now, I have a question with reference to what they're experiencing, both in terms of military depletion, but also the CBC in Canada has noted that literally about 18 months before they rode into Ukraine so rudely, they had made announcements, and Putin had been quite vocal and, if you will, pompous about announcing over $300 billion in oil expansions in the Siberian territory, including building of seaports, entire new seaports, 15 new cities, 1,000 miles of pipeline.
Leonard, I don't mean to be rude. We've got about 14 people up trying to get asked questions. Let's get to the question for the general, please.
Yeah, I know. I'm getting there, Yehuda, but it should resolve itself in just a moment. So anyway, the question is this: they've foregone, obviously, in last 18 months, they've foregone $300 billion in terms of what they had projected, and been totally derailed with the war and their efforts in Ukraine. So based on force we see today on the ground, keeping in mind that they've basically blown out $300 billion that they had planned for civil expenditures, we've seen the massive depletion of their forces on the ground. Do you honestly think that there is a long-term resolve within the Russian, within the Kremlin presently, to see this thing through against Ukraine? And based on what Yehuda was mentioning about up to 700,000 Ukrainian soldiers potentially waiting in the wings, do you think that Russia really has the resolve to do this?
In short, yes. Putin has demonstrated no step back, even with some of the problems that they've had. Whether those around him and the Russian people have the resolve is immaterial. Putin has a stranglehold on that country. Russia is a nation, unfortunately, that is now governed essentially by a highly sophisticated criminal enterprise that has enriched itself in the last 30 years whilst entrenching itself as something that will be extraordinarily difficult to dig out of the body politic in Russia. So I don't see any stepping back from the Russian leadership in the short, medium, or even long term.
Thank you for that. We're going to go to finance. Oh, sorry, John Ridge has had his hand up. I apologize. And we're just going to cycle. There are a lot of people coming up to speak. So after the question, if you get dropped down, just come back up later. We're going to add some more people. Go ahead, John.
Thank you, Yehuda, and thank you for joining us, General Ryan. I wanted to ask you regarding the impact of HIMARS and potential, Russian attempts to mitigate the destruction of their ammunition, fuel depots, and command centers, and the like. as you mentioned, that they can attempt to disperse them, and that would put them under a lot of organizational strain given their centralized command structure. I'm curious, what physical complications would this introduce for the Russians to implement a distributed supply network, in terms of the trucks and other vehicles, instead of now having to go to this one centralized location, they don't have to go to multiple disparate locations. What kind of complications does that introduce?
Well, I think you've answered part of it. They're going to have to use more trucks and less rail if they're really going to distribute their logistics. Part of the problem they have, though, is that the Ukrainians aren't just targeting ammunition stockpiles. They're now starting to target Russian air defence systems. And what this means is not only are Russian logistics hubs and command and control hubs open to HIMARS attack, they'll be more open to attack from the Ukrainian Air Force. So there's a double whammy going on here. And, this could potentially really become an expanding torrent against the Russians unless they're able to adapt in a way that slows down the impact of the HIMARS and allows them to regain momentum in the east. It's not clear to me the Russians have been fast enough at learning and adapting to be able to do that. But, we'll see what happens.
Okay, thank you for that. Let's go to finance, then George.
Hi, General. Thank you very much for coming to the Walter Report. We always appreciate your presence.
It's great to be here.
I'm well aware of the equipment limitations that Ukraine has. Clearly, they have more than nothing, but they don't have everything they want, and I don't think they're going to get everything they want in this war. But that said, there's lots of cases in history where armies with less equipment than their enemies, with better morale and better leadership, have absolutely wiped the floor and conducted huge offensives even when outnumbered. I'm thinking, in more modern times, like Israel had battles in their independence war with like vaguely armored trucks that they sort of welded some plates onto some light trucks, and that's what they had to work with when outnumbered. Things like this that people have been successful with. So I'm aware that Ukraine doesn't have what it wants, but they clearly have an advantage in morale. Leadership, from what I'm hearing, it seems they have an advantage there. So what's the likelihood that sure, they don't have everything they want, but we know they have some tanks. We know they have some other things that they can work with, right? Like that's, they're putting some technicals together because needs must. Their artillery targeting system's great. They've got HIMARS working around the clock over there. Like, isn't this enough that even if it's not pretty, that a lot of good things can happen for them?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, they've already demonstrated that, right, in the initial phases of the war, that by fighting cleverly and not pitting strength against strength, that they are able to defeat the Russians, at least tactically. I'm very optimistic that they can continue doing that, but they can't do it forever without support. And frankly, they're fighting a Russian force that is heavily mechanised, that has a massive advantage in firepower. So they need to have at least some capacity to deal with that, even if they are, targeting them indirectly with HIMARS and stuff. That isn't going to win the war at some point. The Ukrainians have to clear the Russians from their territory, and that will involve close combat. So they're still going to need the capacity to be able to engage in close combat with the Russians, kill Russian soldiers, destroy Russian tanks, eliminate their artillery and their logistics and their commanders in the close fight, to be able to clear them from their territory.
Thank you for that, sir. Then, having said that, I mean, you used American examples of in World War II with the straight leg infantry and who's mechanized and not. Ukrainians there's 3 to 5 tank brigades that I'd say it's fair that we know of that are hiding out in Liger somewhere. With that and the amount of troops that they have available and the mech capability they have, wouldn't it be the time, like now, while there's some kind of lull and HIMARS is in play and the Russians are disoriented, somewhat confused, command and control nodes are being hit, Isn't now the time to take the initiative and just thrust south from Zaporizhia, use what you've got, and cut off Kherson as a first opening salvo?
Yeah, but remember, tank brigades are break-in capabilities. You've then got to exploit it. I mean, this was always the problem in World War One, right? We started using tanks, but forgot you had to win more than the first tactical fight. You needed to break through the first and second lines of defence, and for that you needed follow-on forces. So while they may have 3 to 5 of these tank brigades, they would be a first echelon capability. The Ukrainians are smart enough to know they need a second echelon capability to truly exploit any breakthrough that the tank brigades might be able to take. So my sense is they're waiting to be able to generate a sufficient operational or strategic reserve for those second echelon forces that can exploit any breakthrough made by their armoured forces.
So you don't think that cutting from, I think the salient is, it's about 150 kilometers to the Black Sea down that line. If you looked at Zaporizhia, right, or the Zaporizhia Oblast, it might be 4 days of maneuver warfare in terms of if you take 20, 30 kilometers a day. Would they not be able, with those brigades plus all that infantry and mech infantry plus HIMARS hitting the Russians to the east of that position, that's not a good play? You think that's still not enough? That's still not enough tanks?
No, because the question is that the High Command would ask is, what then? If that is your strategic reserve, what if there's some kind of disaster in Donbass? What do you do with those forces once they've taken that ground? You've got to then reconstitute a strategic reserve, which means you need other forces. So, my sense is if I was looking at this from a high command, I'd be saying, yeah, I need them, but I need the second echelon that does the exploitation and actually holds the ground they take. You don't want tank brigades holding ground, do you? That is a different mission that they are not designed for and frankly are quite poor at. So my sense is it's not so much that they have these break-in forces, it's their exploitation and hold ground forces that they need to be constituting.
So the reason why I said it is because there's been a huge influx or insertion of special forces and partisans in about a 50 kilometer 50 kilometer radius just south of Zaporizhia. And it kind of looks like they were staging, preparing the ground. I would assume the infantry would set up defensive battle positions facing east, and the armor would obviously withdraw to somewhere else for a rainy day. But I see what you're saying. The depth isn't there to do it safely.
Yeah. Yep.
Or as safely as possible.
Yeah. Well,
safe.
Well, no, not safe. It's about sustainable. I mean, can you hold the ground you take is the key, right? Nothing would be worse than Ukraine mounting this a counter-offensive and projecting to the world that they're being successful. All of a sudden, the Russians take it all back because they don't have exploitation or occupation forces to hold on to the ground.
So is your best bet? You're saying just attrit them from the positions they're at with HIMARS until they reach some kind of critical mass?
Well, no. For the time being, I mean that's an economy of force mission and a shaping mission at the moment. But at some point, that will turn to shaping for a dedicated counter-offensive in the south. They'll need more HIMARS to undertake that. They need to ensure they have sufficient forces to be able to do that. I think now that that Severodonetsk, Luhansk pocket is gone. They've shortened the forward line of own troops, which may allow them to have pulled back some brigades to constitute this force that they're probably going to need for a larger scale offensive in the south.
So without these APCs and these IFVs, there's not a real there's a very little chance of conducting some kind of counteroffensive to isolate.
I'm not saying
Kherson.
that. No, I'm not saying that at all. I'm just saying that you're going to need forces to do it. I mean, they will need APCs, but what they need more than anything is they need the formations to do it. And it's not clear to me that they have sufficient forces to undertake that offensive at the moment. But there's a lot. There's a lot we're not seeing in this war.
Right. No, yeah, you know what it is we get hundreds of these questions a day, right?
Yeah.
So they're looking. People, I hate to say, people are looking for hope, and I'm not trying to give them a false hope, but yeah. I mean, from what I'm understanding in the rear, they're doing certain things, but it's you're right. I mean, I don't. I've only done planning up to the brigade levels, nothing higher. So that's why I'm asking you. But thank you. Axel has a question for you. Go ahead, Axel.
What kind of IFVs would you like the Ukrainians to have? How many of them would they need in order to exactly what you just said, prosecute a campaign in the south?
I think the best IFV they could use, just because of the balance of capability and logistic supportability, is the Bradley. I mean, it's the best IFV because it is not. Some of the European IFVs are good, but they're so exquisitely engineered that the supportability and strategic logistics part of it just can't measure up to how the Americans do it. So I think Bradley's, as for an IFV solution, is the best solution. They're going to need hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of these things to undertake a proper operational level counteroffensive. Is that going to happen? Probably not. So how do you satisfy the operational requirement rather than go for the optimal one? And I think it's variants of the old M113s and maybe small injections of IFVs in the 1-200 level. I mean, this is, like I said, the problem we have is we need to provide armoured vehicles at a scale that no country has operated or manufactured for 70 years, with the exception of the Americans and Russians during the Cold War. So, for a lot of people, when you talk about, we need hundreds of IFVs, that they go into a intellectual blue screen of death. They just they can't conceptualise the scale that's required. And that's part of the problem with the political class. I mean, because they're so focused on...
But you can. I'm sorry.
Sorry.
General Ryan, I hate to interrupt you, but I have to. You can actually envisage this. You know that there's approximately 2,800 of them stored.
Correct. And there's 3,000 of them, 3,000 M1s stored out there in the desert in California. I know, because our country took 100 of them and upgraded them. So,
So what's holding us back?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I think part of it is the capacity of the Ukrainians to absorb them. But I still think there's a reticence. There's this escalation fear from certain politicians, which is way overblown. Giving the Ukrainians 1,000 IFVs doesn't, in any way lead the Russians to say, we need to go nuclear. I mean, it's a ludicrous and illogical proposition that somehow President Biden and his advisors have bought into. Do we want the Russians to not win, or do we want them to be defeated? It's a big difference.
Yep. Yeah, no, it's politics in the end in that regard. Sir, it's been a pleasure. I'll try to pop back in, but it's always a pleasure to speak with you. And
I was just passing on to Omar, just like you. Apologies. Please go on.
Yeah, thank you. A quick question. So the Russians are known to not throw anything away. It's basically, they call them army of hoarders. We do, I believe, after Iraq and the threat of IEDs, all Humvees were supposed to be phased out. And were they disposed of, or are they in Arizona somewhere? Or would that help Ukraine, given that it's not that Ukraine is fighting an insurgency, it's an actual conventional war, so there is less threat, although there is mind and so, but would actually transferring all our stock of these would help. And also the arrival of the Archer, what do you think of that? I believe it's Swedish, correct?
So Humvees and Archers.
Yeah, I don't know enough about Archers to really contribute on that score. Humvees, they're a good vehicle, but so are Land Rovers. At the end of the day, they're a four-wheel drive with a little bit of armour on them. I know, and I've operated in them around Baghdad and other places. They're not going to be in the close fight. They are a useful command and liaison vehicle, potentially in some longer-range reconnaissance tasks and administrative tasks for unit headquarters. But if the Ukrainians already have the capacity to produce a similar vehicle, I wouldn't be imposing on them another vehicle that's going to, expand their logistic liability.
Appreciated. Thank you, General Ryan. It has been a pleasure. Yet again, still haven't seen the war being won.
No, unfortunately.
What do you think the impact of the ATACMS will be?
Sorry, the impact of...
the ATACMS.
The ATACMS, yeah. Okay, so if indeed they are able to get this missile, there's a couple of things. Firstly, it really allows the Ukrainians to ensure the launcher is well protected. I mean, you can step back a long way to launch a ATACMS missile. But the other side of this is you can strike out much further. You can hold Russian targets at risk that currently are not. And I think the big target is Crimea. I mean, the naval base at Sevastopol is an important Russian naval base. If the Ukrainians were able to hold at risk every ship sitting in that port, that would really change the calculus for the Russians. Now, the other side of this is it might be the justification the Russians want for stepping up missile strikes or even tactical nuclear demonstrations. But, the ATACMS would be a step change in the long-range strike capability of the Ukrainian armed forces.
Much appreciated. Also begs the question as to whether if the ATACMS are in theatre and the Ukrainians have enough of them, whether the perceived old doctrine of escalate to de-escalate actually comes up, because they know that the Ukrainians can strike them.
That's right. No, I think that's an important question, and it's that escalation question is one you can never overlook. But we should also be careful not to scare ourselves too much. Let's not be, as Ben Hodges say, be treated by a chihuahua, because we're afraid of escalation in everything we do.
I loved that you just brought this up. Thank you.
You're very welcome. Hey, I've got to go. So, it's been great to be with you all again.
Thank you very much.
Thanks, everyone. Have a great weekend. Have a great weekend.